Good morning. I played the fourth round of the current Wachusett Chess Club tournament last night, and I had the black pieces. Actually, let me flip this around. Against Ray Paulson, who's rated just over 2,000, but I think has been rated as high as the 2100s. He played d4, I played knight f6, and bishop to g5 signals the Trompowsky. And as far as I understand it, White's idea is to take on f6 and damage Black's pawn structure, and claim that that is compensation for giving up the two bishops. I played e6, avoiding doubled pawns by allowing a recapture on f6 with the queen, knight f3, and h6, asking the bishop whether it would like to capture on f6, or retreat to a square that doesn't allow it to remain on both of these diagonals. Ray took on f6, I played queen takes f6, and he played e3. And this looks pretty solid to me. He gets rid of his dark squared bishop, and then he puts his entire central pawn chain on dark squares. It's hard to take issue with that. I played d5. Ray played knight bd2, which I thought indicated that he either wanted to play e4, or he wanted to stick this knight on e5, and then with or without the move f4, put the other knight on f3. I played bishop d6, understanding that he could play e4, which he did, and my idea was I would take on e4, and after knight takes e4, I would move my queen out of the way, and if Ray took on d6 with his knight, I'd take back with my c-pawn, leaving me with an extra central pawn. But the move I played here, in hindsight, I don't like very much, and that's queen f4. It's very active. It threatens the knight immediately, encouraging a trade on d6. But the problem is that the queen is very short on squares, on escape squares. So I think White should have played bishop to d3 here. And now the idea is if I play something normal, like castle kingside, White can play g3. And my queen turns out to be in big trouble. If I go back to f5, knight takes d6 is going to win a piece. So I'd have to go to g4. And then after h3, again, if I go to f5 or g6, there's knight takes d6. So I'd have to go to h5. And then after g4, I'd be... Okay, now with the benefit of hindsight, I see that I can escape to the queen side with check, which would have saved my queen. But immediately after I played this queen f4 move during the game, I became convinced that that I'd have to play the move e5 here in order to allow my queen to retreat along a light squared diagonal. I played queen f4 though, and the idea was if he took on d6, which he did, then after c takes d6, I have two central pawns to White's one, and I have a very active queen on f4 controlling dark squared diagonals. And as I've mentioned in the past, once you trade a pair of bishops, the queens take up responsibility for controlling the diagonals of that color. Ray played bishop to d3, nice developing move. I played knight c6, and I wonder if there isn't an improvement here for Black somewhere, because I ended up not liking the performance of my knight on c6. It comes with several ideas. One is to put more pressure on d4, but that pressure is not real, because even if I got another move and played knight takes d4 here, then after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop to b5 check, I'd drop my queen on d4. It also prepares maybe to go knight to b4. And the third idea is that I'd like to support the move e5 so that I can activate my light squared bishop by bringing it out to the king side. But White deals with two of these ideas with c3. And again, the capture on d4 wasn't really an idea for Black anyway. And it turns out that as happened in the game, after I play e5, the e4 square gets pretty weak for me. So perhaps back here, instead of knight to c6, I should have brought the knight out to the king side on f6, which covers e4, but I guess that has the downside of again, leaving the queen without very many squares. And I also maybe should have considered playing b6 and bishop to b7 as a way of activating the light squared bishop. But I played knight c6, c3, and castled kingside. Ray played g3, ejecting my queen from his kingside. I think that makes some sense, but it has the downside that it weakens the light squares on in front of where white's king is likely to end up. Queen to f6, castle kingside, and e5. So now I'm, I guess, taking more space in the center, making use of my extra central pawn. And I'd like to, if I get the chance, trade light squared bishops with the move bishop to f5. Without a knight on f6, I'm a little bit vulnerable, and without control of the e4 square, I'm a little bit vulnerable on h7. So at some point white could go queen e2 to e4 to h7 checkmate. Now luckily for me that takes more than one move, but it's now on the radar screen for white. Ray played d takes e5, and I recaptured on e5 with my pawn. I wonder here again in hindsight if I might have been better off playing knight takes e5. With an eye to getting these knights traded off, at which point if he tries queen e2 intending queen e4, I'll have time for bishop to f5. But there's a real argument to be made for the idea that when you have more space than your opponent, which is the case for black here, black's the only one with a pawn on the 4th rank, you don't want to trade pieces. It kind of lessens the issues your opponent has to deal with. Ray played knight h4, and I suspect that a computer would not like this move, but it was very interesting during the game because it helped to stop me from trading light squared bishops, which keeps alive this idea of queen e2, queen e4, queen h7. I had quite a hard time dealing with that, and it was all this trouble I had with the e4 square that led me to believe that maybe earlier in the game I should either have put my queenside knight on f6, or developed my bishop to b7, or played d5 instead of e5. I played rook d8, pinning this bishop on d3, but Ray naturally unpins with queen e2, nice move from him. Now I have to start to watch out for the move queen e4. If I remember correctly, no, I played bishop e6, okay. Well, bishop e6, of course, has the idea of developing the light squared bishop. Keep looking at this a2 pawn just in case that's ever something I can capture. And I'd like to develop my other rook, in this case to c8. Ray played b3. I'm not sure about that move. It kind of signals that white doesn't intend to attack on the king side, but instead to develop this a rook to the center of the board. And maybe there just is no attack after queen e4 and g6 from black. But these kinds of things are what worry me during a game. Ray played b3, and I played g6 preemptively, just to shut down the idea of queen e4. Although now I'm opening up some sacrificial ideas on g6 later on. You've got to be careful whenever you move the pawns in front of your king. You can often deal with one issue, but in the process you end up opening yourself up to something else. Maybe instead I should just have developed my remaining rook to c8. Ray played rook fe1, and it was at this point in the game that I began to appreciate that the pawn on e5 might be a serious weakness. White already has 2 attackers on it, and he can remove one of my defenders by playing either bishop to e4 or bishop to b5, and then capturing on c6, after which he can take on e5 with his queen. And all that I came up with as a way to counter that was to try to use tactics to get counterplay. I played rook a to c8. My idea was that in one of these lines I might be taking his pawn on c3 and ending up with active rooks. Ray played bishop to e4. Another option was bishop to b5, which I intended during the game to respond to with bishop to h3. Very strange looking move, but my idea was that after bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, I'd be threatening queen g2 checkmate. Apparently oblivious to the fact that there's a knight on h4. But I'm also threatening this pawn on c3, and should white capture on e5, I may immediately have the move g5 winning a piece because white can't move that knight away without allowing a mate or the capture of the piece on f3. But Ray instead played bishop to e4, a different way of attacking the knight, and my idea in response to this was that I would try to trade light squared bishops with bishop to d4. Ray played rook a to d1, activating his last piece. I sort of jumped at the opportunity to get these bishops off of the board, hoping to reduce the pressure on my king side, and basically playing according to the idea that you should trade off your bad pieces for your opponent's good ones, at which point the pieces that will be left on the board will be better for you. I think my knight on c6 is slightly better than the knight on h4. These rooks are about equal. My rook on c8 is probably inferior to his rook on e1, and the queens are about the same. So eliminating his better minor piece, I think, was a good idea here. But after queen e4, his queen comes to a good square, and I've obviously got more work to do to rid white of good pieces. The next step, though, I thought was to eliminate the disadvantage of the rook on c8 compared to the one on e1 by taking on d1 and playing rook d8. Ray chose to trade on d8, and there's maybe one more big decision here for black, which is how to recapture on the d8 square. Knight takes d8 does not drop the b7 pawn because it simultaneously guards that pawn, and the knight can come back to c6. But I really wanted to play the more active queen takes d8, which is what I played, with the idea to invade at some point along the d-file. But in order to do that, I had to be comfortable with white playing knight takes g6. And after f takes g6, queen takes g6 check, king f8, queen takes h6. The idea is white has gotten 3 pawns for the piece. And the piece is sitting on c6, restricted by a white pawn and by the black pawn on e5, and so it's not yet a particularly good minor piece. And white has a protected passed pawn in what is something like a queen ending, which may lead to him promoting and winning the game. But my idea here was that if white goes down this line, as long as he doesn't have some kind of perpetual check, he'll have to decide between trying to use his passed pawn and keeping his king safe. And I thought if he didn't use his passed pawn, my knight would eventually be worth more than these pawns on the king side. And if he did, maybe my queen and knight could sneak around his pawn structure and go after his king. I think the game would have continued king e8 when the only useful check for white, I think, is queen to e6. But after queen to e7, it's not clear where white's going from here. Black is now protecting everything in his camp. There's queen c8 check. Maybe I'd have to go knight d8 here, but at this point white is out of checks and black can start to look to improve his pieces and go after the white king or win a pawn somewhere, maybe the pawn on c3 or a2. I'm making it sound simpler than it is, though. This looks very tricky to me. Ray chose not to take on c6. Instead, he played queen e2. I think superior to queen e2 is reactivating the knight with knight f3. Yeah, I can play queen d1 check, but after king g2, it's not obvious how I'm going to follow up. And white is putting pressure on this pawn on e5. But Ray played queen e2 to stop the queen invasion, I assume. It also looks at this b5 square, which he may use later to attack weaknesses on the queen side. but it allows queen d5, which keeps the queen on the d-file, guards the b5 square, and makes it clear that the black queen is now superior to the white one. Ray played knight g2 with, I think, the idea to go knight e3 and reactivate the knight, which makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to be able to respond to knight e3 with queen to e4, pinning the knight to the white queen. But I didn't want to allow queen b5 going after my queen side, so I played the otherwise strange-looking move a6. And after Ray's knight e3, I went queen e4. Okay, there's a sticky situation here for white, because this pin might eventually cost white material. If I can get my king to some safer square and then go f5, f4, white will lose that knight on e3. So Ray decided to deal with that immediately with queen c2, and this also prevents my queen from entering along the h7, b1 diagonal. But after queen takes c2, knight takes c2 as in the game, and then f5, we have a knight endgame in which black should be slightly better, or even much better. The reason for that is that though material is equal, and each player has a pawn majority, black's pawn majority is giving him a whole bunch of central space, whereas white's majority can't really do that, and that's because black's majority includes a pawn on a central file, the e5 pawn. And because black has more space, he's likely to end up with a more active king. And so with more space and a more active king, and maybe possibly a faster conversion of his majority into a passed pawn on the e file, for example, we're not all that far away from black's small advantages adding up to something big. Ray played knight to e3. I activated my king with king f7. Ray played king e1, king e6, king e2, and I played e4 to restrict the white king in order to maintain my advantage of king activity and to threaten to make it even more severe by at some point putting my king on the e5 square. Although right now I don't think that makes a lot of sense because it'll just get kicked away by the knight from c4. Ray played h4, and white may already be in serious trouble here, but I don't like this move on principle, because black wants to convert this majority into a passed pawn. And so when white moves his kingside pawns, unless he inhibits black in some way by doing that, he's kind of helping with that conversion. Instead, white should be looking to convert his majority into a passed pawn, although that's difficult to do, because as soon as c4 is played, the d4 and b4 squares become available to the black knight. Ray played h4, I played g5, continuing to take space on the king side. H takes g5, h takes g5. Ray played b4, I assume with the idea to expand on the queen side and work toward converting his own majority. And there's an important idea in these minor piece endgames, which is that if you're on the defending side, and you can effect enough pawn trades, you can sometimes get into a situation in which you can sacrifice your minor piece for the remaining pawn or pawns, and leave your opponent with only a minor piece, which of course is a draw. I played f4 though, and after gf4, black's pawns are now in control of a tremendous amount of space, and this results not right now, but it will eventually result in a big difference in king activity. Knight c4. Alright, I'd love to go king d5 here, but white will immediately eject the king with knight to b6 when all four of these squares are attacked by white. So I played knight to e5, but of course in order to play the move knight e5, which improves the knight, I have to make sure that the resulting king and pawn ending is good for black. And I think it is. After knight takes e5, king takes e5, white has a big hole on c4 which my king will march into. At which point there will be a capture threatened on c3. And I'm trying to remember what variation I was looking at here. Maybe king d2, king d5, for example, king e2, king c4, king d2. And now he's temporarily stopped me from taking the pawn on c3, but I can go e3 check, fe3, fe3, king e3, king takes c3, and my king is closer to his pawns than his is, either to his own to defend them or to mine to counterattack. Having said that, however, no, this should still be, that's right, I think I looked at this and it should still be winning for black. After a3, king to b3, king to d3, king takes a3, king c3. Black can just play b5, and now we have a situation I have talked about a lot in the past, and that's one in which there are locked pawns, and black's king actually doesn't have to occupy one of the 3 critical squares horizontally adjacent to the pawn on either side, because he's already in the white camp. White's on defense, and white's problem here is that he has no way to waste a move with the king. So he would drop this pawn on b4 and the game shortly thereafter. So Ray, I think, correctly decided not to take on e5. He played knight b2, but now I get to play king c4 because there's no more knight b6 check. Ray played knight to a4, and there are, I think, a few good options here for black. I considered f3 check with the idea that if the king comes up to e3, knight to g4 check would pick off the pawn on f2, and black at that point should be winning with connected passed pawns. I also considered just king to c4, but my issue with that move was that after knight to b6 check, king takes c3, knight d5 check, black's going to grab this pawn on f4. And it's possible that black is still just in great shape, but white is trading pawns here, which means he's getting closer to a situation in which he can sack his knight for a draw. And I also analyzed the move knight to d3, which is what I ended up playing in the game. And what really appealed to me about this is that it set off a tactical alarm bell in my mind when I realized that the knight on a4 was very short on squares. Can't go to c3, of course, because that's occupied by a white pawn. And now the b2 square is guarded by the knight on d3, and the c5 square isn't a good option for white either because it'll cost him a pawn. So if I could make my king show up on the b5 square, white wouldn't have any choice but to play knight to c5, allowing a trade, after which black should have a winning king and pawn ending. I want to point out here that I am threatening knight c1, and that I was thinking during the game of the possibility of white playing f3, trying to undermine the knight on d3. But I thought after knight c1 check, king d2, I might have this move. Maybe I can just take on a... No, can I take on a2? Yeah, I can probably just take on a2 because he can't come over and grab the knight, probably without allowing the queening of a pawn. But I also thought maybe this e takes f3 would just be a strong move, with the idea that if I lose my knight, I play f2. And it doesn't look like there's any way for white to do anything about that. So white in this position defended his a pawn by moving it off of the a2 square. But that gives me time to play king c4, and now knight b6 check, king takes c3, knight d5 check does not hang the pawn on f4, which is guarded by the knight on d3. And after raise f3, black may have more than one way to win, but the one that was appealing to me that I calculated and decided to go for was this capture on f3, after which when white takes back, I have king b5. And now this knight on a4 has nowhere to go. White can come counterattack my knight if he wants to, but after the trade, white will have to go after this f-pawn, and that will cost him all of his queenside pawns and the game. So So Ray instead played knight c5, but this is not much better. Knight takes c5, b takes c5, king takes c5. White has to take the pawn on f4, and now after king c4, White is dropping his queenside pawns because his king is too far away to do anything about it. Ray played king e5, king takes c3, and he played king d5. King d6 is not much better because I can play king to b3, and then after king c7, b5, king b6, king takes a3, and there's no stopping the b pawn. But Ray played king d5, and after king b3, king c5, I played king takes a3, he played king b6, and after my king to b4, it's the a pawn instead which can't be stopped, and Ray resigned. I'm at 4 out of 4 in this tournament. We've got 1 round left, and next week I'm going to be playing against Roger Capallo, the second highest rated player in the tournament. I'll have the white pieces, but he's a very tough opponent, so I'm sure that'll be a good game, and I look forward to bringing it to you next week. Thanks a lot.